Okay, so another video here, and I thought this one would be useful to people, especially just with present circumstances. And I'm going to call it spirit walking, but it's really not. I just made that up. When I think of this practice, I call it spirit walking, but it might be more akin to walking meditation. And so the question is, so we have this relationship with God, and God is downloading its spirit and its power into us, and it's taking us on progressive stages of awakening and purification. And we want to include our body in that process, and in fact it is included naturally. And that's why people get very strange physical symptoms along the way of a spiritual path. A friend of mine, when he first started meditating, went to the hospital. He went to the doctor a number of times to check on very strange physical symptoms he was having as a result of interacting with the power of God. And he only quit going when the doctor suggested a psychologist. And so we know that physical symptoms can come with a transformation in God's power. So we know the body's included. We also know from the saints who, many of the Christian saints' bodies don't corrupt in the usual way. They don't degenerate after death. And this is because there's so much of God's power infused into the physical body that the body itself becomes sacratized and made holy. And so how can we, what kind of an exercise could we bring into our spiritual practice that could be a part of that spiritual practice? And I've thought about doing a video like this for a while, and there's a number of choices that I could have brought in as the model. But what I think is walking is the best, and I call it spirit walking. And that's not, really the name. It's just what I come up with to describe this process. And so walking is not inherently spiritual. But if there's an intent for it to be a spiritual practice, then it becomes something sacred. And so we know that any practice and any physical activity or any activity at all can become holy, provided the intent for a connection with God and a receptivity to God's power is present. And so that's what we're looking for with this kind of spiritual walking. And so it is exercise in that you're going to go out for a 20-minute or a 45-minute walk. That is a form of exercise really good for everybody. But how do we make that into a spiritual practice? And the first stage, or the first thing that needs to be in place, is that has to be the reason for the walk. And this is where a bit of refinement needs to set in. So there's this motivation for health, where you're going on a walk strictly for the exercise, and that is the primary sort of driver in your will for exercise. And that would be not a deep enough intent to make this a purely and deeply spiritual practice. But you could go on the exact same walk that you had, probably the same walk that you had planned, but your intent could be primarily to dwell in a relationship with God during that walk. And so it's intent first. It's the same with our prayer life. It's the same with, when an issue arises and we offer it up to God, and our intent is to allow God to heal it or not. And how opening our will to God in light of a particular issue that we have allows God's power to enter into that issue and to begin to heal it. And that's what it is with this spiritual walking, that you're going on this walk with the primary intent to be with God. And a secondary intent is the practice, the method is walking. And so that has to be first. And if you're extra exercise oriented, that might be a switch that you have to be very present with in your will, because you'll make different choices along the way of that walk if your intention is to be with God or if your primary intention is for exercise. And we want that the primary intention to be as a spiritual practice to dwell with God. And okay, and I took notes for this one. It's a practice, so it's not something I can just free flow as well. So the structure of the body is what a human being is, according to Christian spirituality, is a composite of spiritual and physical. That it is both, and it's both by design, and that we are physical beings not by accident or not because we fell from grace, but because we are creations of God meant to be physical beings. And so the body has a way of interacting with the soul. There's a communication between the body and the soul and God. And so then there's a channel of power from God to the soul to the body. And so that is what it means to be a human being. What it means to be a human being is a physical being that is also a spiritual being, and that's by design. And according to Christian theology, that doesn't end when we die. Even though our body corrupts and is buried and turns to dust, there is a future point at which God's intention for humanity is to reunite our transcendent and ascended souls, our heavenly souls, with a body and have a new kind of body. And that's what Jesus demonstrated for us in the ascension. After his death and resurrection and then ascension, he demonstrated for us the ultimate goal of the physical being is to be transcended, a transcendent physical being. The nature of that we do not know for sure. We know that Jesus was unrecognizable to his disciples even when he was physically present with them. We know that he could eat. We don't know that he needed to eat, but we know that he could eat. We know that he could touch and feel and grab, but that also he didn't look the same, or his appearance was malleable in some way, possibly. But we know that he had a body, and he took that body with him into ascension, and that is our ultimate end. For humanity, is to be physical beings that are in perfect union with God, and that our bodies would be brought into that same perfect union, and then that would be a different kind of a body. And so the body is sacred in Christian spirituality. Being a human being is not an accident. It's not something we're trying to transcend or avoid. Our humanness is part of what is perfected by our spiritual path. That's the idea. And so it would make sense that a spiritual practice could be included in, and this is just by accident. I didn't choose walking for this reason, but Jesus walked everywhere he went. They walked miles and miles and miles through nature. And Jesus also seemed to retreat, to walk to nature spots in order to find his rejuvenation and in order to pray, in order to get away from the work that he was doing so that he could come back afresh and with clarity. And so it's kind of neat that this practice of walking in nature would be a part of that, a part of our sort of attempt at divinizing or allowing God to divinize the body. And that's the idea, to allow God's power to dwell in our bodies and to enter into a meditative or a contemplative state while walking, so that the walking and God and the meditative state are all one thing and they're all present. And I just thought I'd give a little direction on what that might look like, but I want to say that this isn't a dogma. So if you can enter the Spirit and walk, you have found the way. Maybe you need to slow down a little bit and notice the various ways in which this spiritual walking can unfold and can manifest itself in your experience. Maybe there's some room for that. And so even if you can already find this, maybe some of the things I say will help just to deepen that practice. But also we want you to find that, and we don't want you to get hung up dogmatically on the language that I'm using about it, because it's a relationship with God in movement that we're looking for. And I think walking is by far the very best sort of foundational exercise for this. I think it's very natural. It's simple. I like how simple it is. And so we'll just go through the basics of it. And the first I want to say is that there's two kinds of walking, spirit walking, and is slow and fast. And fast could just be anything from just a moderate normal pace to a quicker pace that you might take when you're feeling invigorated, or when you want to get your heart rate up and, do 40 minutes of faster walking, a little more exercise focused. So we'll call that fast walking. And it is, but it's done in this spiritual intent. And so there must be that sustained practice of being in God's power in one of three ways during fast walking. You're either using that walk and that time to pray and be with God in, verbal communication, or you are using that walking time to contemplate and think deeply about spirituality. So, this is just one of my favorite practices. There's a point of theology, let's say, that you have confusion around, or a part of your spiritual path where there's disorder, and it could benefit from a half an hour of sustained intuitive thought with God. So then that would be a great time for fast walking, where you're just taking a walk, but that entire time is spent in communion with God and in thought and intuitive receptivity to God. And you're thinking about theology, or you're thinking about spiritual truth, or you're thinking about, a relationship that may need work or help, or you're thinking about somebody in your life who may be suffering, and what way you might be useful to them. And this walking, what I've noticed is at that pace, the normal to a slightly sped up pace of walking is quite meditative. And in 5 or 10 minutes of it, you enter a bit of a trance. I've noticed you can enter a bit of an altered state of consciousness that's a bit of a trance. And so a 30 minutes or 40 minutes sustained of that, or 20 minutes, whatever the case may be, your intelligence seems to raise. You seem to become more clear, more intuitive, and there's just this extra sort of sense of connection with God in that way. And so just normal walking, just a normal walk, can be extra spiritual if that is the intent and if you're opening up to that. And I want to just say, and I'll probably say it again later because I'm going off some notes, that if you can walk in nature, it's better. But I don't mean you have to drive to the mountains. My experience is that every park, just about all the parks in the valley, can be quite powerful for this. Trees, and there's water, and there's rocks, and there's earth, and there's animal life. There's ducks and birds and rats and mice, and there's a lot of true nature that can be found without ever leaving the city. And if you're out south, there's a giant gully out there, and there's so much nature there. And then if you're north, there's all these wonderful parks that are quite connected and quite nature based. Sugar House Park is my favorite of all because there's a giant lake, and then there's a river that runs through it, and you can walk along the river, and there's the sound of the water, and there's trees, and there's all of that as a part of it. So that's fast walking, and I typically use fast walking as a way to get to slow walking. So a lot of times I use it as a way to get to a location where I could maybe enter into a deeper place. And slow walking is different than, so fast walking is kind of just normal walking, but with the sustained attention on God. In prayer with God, or in thought with God, or in just listening to God's power. But then let's talk about slow walking, which I think is a superior form, a more deeply spiritual form of it. And that's where you slow down, and you slow down intentionally. And I try to do this in a secret way. It's better not to be noticed, to be, overtly spiritual and be noticed as being overtly spiritual. So it's, if you can, there's no rule here, but we're always not trying to draw attention to ourselves. And so we're not doing this to be noticed, right? We're doing this as a hidden secret practice. We're going to our inner room and we're praying in secret with God in this way. And the cover of night is just one of the great times to do that, because it's dark and nobody is looking. But also there, you'd be surprised how many places in a park, in almost any park, that you can find that are just more off the beaten path, more apart from, more away from people, and where nature is a bit more prominent, and there are trees and animals and all of that, and so slow walking, you slow this pace down. And I don't want to say how slow, because it's not really a dogma, but it's slow enough that you have to intentionally move more slowly. And I'm going to send out a letter, a document, kind of describing all of this. I've already written it, and I'll email it to everyone that's a part of the center. And if you're not on the group email list, maybe you could send me an email, and I'll send it to you individually. So none of this information is lost. But slow walking is very different, because you slow way down mentally and physically, and you walk in a much more intentional way. And that is something that is hard to describe well. It's not so easy to describe this, but let's just say that right now my hand is sitting here. You can see my hand on screen. It's just sitting here. But my fingers, they're just in, they don't look like they're doing anything special. But as it turns out, I am holding my fingers in the position they're in. It's not accidental. There's intention in the way that I'm holding my hand right now. I don't have to hold it in a magic symbol position. There's no magic to this. I don't have to hold it in a particular posture. It doesn't matter what posture my hand or my arms or my body is in. What matters is that I'm holding that posture intentionally. That's part of slow walking. So that every movement is still natural. It might look almost identical to, just casual, non-present movement. It might look almost imperceptible. It might look identical in your perception. But underneath it, there's an intention where your whole body and your face and your eyes, your tongue, where everything is being held in an intentional position and moved intentionally. And that becomes a physical mantra. When we sit down and we pick our sacred word and we say that sacred word over and over, that becomes our focus of attention. And then the intent, though, is to be open to God's power, and that creates this connection. Well, this is the same, only now your mantra, it might also be mental, it could be, but now it is also physical. And when your foot hits the ground in this kind of walking, it needs to not just slam down on the ground in a happenstance sort of way. When you're doing slow walking, you're placing your foot very specifically onto the ground. And in a way that is sacred. You're placing each foot intentionally somewhere, and you're touching the earth with your foot. You're not stepping on the earth. you're touching it. And this can be done with shoes on, and in the summer it can be done bare feet if you're open to that. And you're gently placing your foot on the earth, and you're noticing this sense of the sacred, this sense of the sacred connection with your body and the earth below you. And so that every movement in slow walking is done with sacred and holy intent. Your sense of consciousness is alerted. It's more present. You're very aware of your body because every movement is intentional. And even your eyes are intentionally looking at what you're seeing. It's relaxed. It's flowing. It's not rigid. But everything is intentional. And you might even be sometimes shifting your eyes between noticing particular things, like maybe the terrain you're walking in so you don't fall, but also sometimes softening that gaze so that you're just taking in everything in general and you're not looking at every one thing in specific. So it can kind of phase back and forth between those two extremes of just noticing everything in general and paying attention to particular things. But let me just check my notes. Just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so this is you'll notice that you move more gracefully. You might, I'm not going to say this is a rule, but you might just bend your knees at slightly more than normal, so that if you bend your knees slightly, you can place your feet down much more intentionally, because if you normal walking is a controlled fall. You're really stepping forward and falling forward, and we've just gotten so good at this as bipedal beings that we're just falling and then landing and falling and then landing. But and that can become quite a mindless experience, and it probably should. If you have to walk 20 miles, you just walk. But in this kind of walking, you can slow down and you can bend your knees a little, and this gives you the ability to stretch out one foot without losing your balance on the other foot and place it more, and then come forward and stretch out and place the other foot, and you can move much more silently, quietly, and gently through the physical environment in this way. And I thought maybe if you watched a cat stalking something, you might get an idea of the intention of this kind of walking. But you could also, I thought that's not fair, that most animals can be quite present in this way. Deer sometimes will walk so intentionally, so gently and gracefully. You can tell that they're, because of the need for silence, they're putting their foot exactly where they want to put it. They're not just letting it land any old place. They're putting their foot exactly where they intend to put it. And that kind of focus with the intent to dwell with God intensifies our connection in the same way that really focusing on our sacred word intensifies our prayer life. So that is slow spirit walking, and that's the superior form. And there's three kinds of that, and there's really three kinds of all of that, either kind of walking really. But the lowest kind we'll say is meditative, and we discussed that with fast walking, where you're moving through your environment slowly, and you're being contemplative, you're being thoughtful in a spiritual way. And we discussed that with fast walking. But there's this openness to God's power. There's probably an awareness of God's power. But then there's this thoughtfulness about theology, about inventory and purification, about how to better be of service or a quality friend, how to better be of service to our children or our parents or our family members, how to be a better member of a community, all the kinds of thoughts that we naturally go through trying to be spiritual beings on this planet. this slow walking could be a time for that. And I think if you slow everything down, you'll really notice that it becomes quite a bit more sacred and quite a bit more holy. There just is a holiness that can set in with this. So that we would call that meditative level. And the second one, I didn't know what to call it. I'm going to call it shamanic, but nothing that I learned from shamanism survived the Christian approach to life that I eventually entered. So this is really modified. It wouldn't really qualify as shamanism, but I sort of picked it up from shamanism, and then it went through its purification stages through the work of the Holy Spirit until it was truly a Christian practice. But this would be the same slow walking with the intent to dwell with God, but with a deeper connection to one's environment. And so think of a trail. My favorite trail is at Sugar House Park, starting at the lake and going up the river to its end and then coming around the other side and coming down the other side. And it gets quite hidden about halfway through. There's a patch there which looks like you're in a trail in the woods, and there are trees, and there's a river, and you almost never see anyone back there. Or if you do, they're just walking by. And so if you think of a trail like that, from point A to point B, the beginning of that and the end of that, there are the environment is alive, right? There are trees and stones and river and earth and animal life, and there's power in that environment. There's a way in which God's power is mediated to us through nature, right? God's power does pour out of a tree differently. It seems to be expressed differently through tree than it is through river or stone. And if one is attuned to the environment in this sacred way and sees all these natural objects as creations of God, then it shouldn't be much of a leap to see these natural objects as sacred. And but to notice that sacred power emanating off of these objects, one would have to place themselves in a state to notice that. It's, you could be sitting next to a spiritual master and not know it because you're so shallow you can't see it. And it's like that with nature. So what I'm calling shamanic isn't really shamanic, but it's this slow walking with God and environment that is sensitive to and noticing of and participating in the different kinds of sacred energy and power and beauty that various locations and objects within the natural environment provide. And this is very close to my favorite kind of walking. And if you do it in this way, you will notice certain secret little places that are, even in a park that's so visited as Sugar House Park or anywhere really, you'll notice that there are just certain places that are more dense and thick with that power than others. And you can notice that and participate in that. And you might even enter one of those spots and stand or sit before you move on again. All of this led by the Holy Spirit, right? Without an agenda. We don't have an agenda here. We're not trying to find power and grab it and store it and take it home. We're not treating it as something we can control or take. We're being led here through all the foundational practices of Christian mysticism, of only wanting God's will and of not wanting more power or less power or more comfortable power or less comfortable power, but just the power that God wants to give us. So we're being led spiritually on this walk through nature, which is sacred and which in some ways mediates God's power to us through its forms, through the reed and, through the duck and through the eddy in the river and through the stone. And that all of this is quite sacred and quite profound if we are present to notice this, and that we can interact with these sacred objects and beings, the animal beings and tree beings. We can interact with these in a sacred way if we are present to that. So I would say that is the next stage deeper, and all these stages are malleable and they're combinable. It's not really rigid, you're here or you're here or you're here, but these are just to point out the different levels of depth that one can tap into. And then the third stage, we would call that contemplative. And we know that in Christian spirituality, contemplative means not thinking. And so this all could happen in one walk. The walk could begin meditative, thinking and praying. And then it could move into a more shamanic sort of a state where there's still thought possibly and interaction going on with objects and beings. The squirrel in the tree, right? Taking the time to be with that squirrel and mystically to spiritually be with it. It has a connection to God. It doesn't get on the internet for half the day. It's not so polluted. And you can have that connection with God, and you can share. You can actually have a mystical connection with that squirrel, right? You can do that. And people do all the time. And it's quite profound and satisfying and rich to have that. So it could naturally go from a meditative to a more shamanic towards the contemplative, and the contemplative is marked by less thought or no thought, and when that happens, quite a profound alertness that can arise. It's restful, but you're quite alert, and you're very aware of God's presence now. There's quite a sense of the sacred. There's quite a sense of the Holy Spirit living inside of you. And this can include still interaction with the environment or not. It depends. There's so many stages within this. But it's even more slowed down than the other stages. And you can't control this, but when it opens, it's quite profoundly sacred and holy. And I'm not going to say all the ways it can feel and all the things within that you can experience, but there's just a range of very direct, intense sort of connection with God that can occur when you slow things down enough for that to happen. And that would be the contemplative dimension of a spirit walk. And I mean, I could say just basically, a deep sense of the sacred, I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'd say or not and, or a profound sense of holiness, or a quite tangible awareness of God's presence in your body. It's really common for your feet and legs and hands and arms to glow and feel quite full. And as if they're moving of their own accord, each foot placement is happening. You're doing it, but it almost feels light and effortless now. Now the power is moving you rather than your muscles. And that's a level that you can come to. I don't mean it's a high attainment or anything, but it's something that can happen where you're moving so gracefully through the environment because now the power of God is what is moving you, more than it is you that is moving you. And a contemplative state would generally be less likely to be specifically in tune with that tree or that stone or that reed or that squirrel. I'm not saying it couldn't be, but it's more likely for the contemplative dimension of this to be a connection to everything in general, all at once, maybe rather than being specifically connected to any one thing. And this is a sort of through God, our connection connects us to all of creation. And if the focus is, if there's no thought, if all of that is quieted way down, then we enter this place where we're connected to everything equally without preference. And a sort of a spaciousness can open, similar to a spaciousness that can open up in deep meditation when you're looking into the darkness, and that darkness no longer becomes a small area, but it becomes a large, spacious area. That same spaciousness can open on the walk and penetrate, it seems, through all physical objects, so that one feels connected to the center of the stone and the reed and the squirrel and the river all at once equally, because God is connected to all of that all at once equally. And so it's sort of a through God we find ourselves connected to all things in a non-biased, equal way. And that can be a real high point in a spirit walk. Now, we don't aim for this, we're open to it. We're making space for it. But just like in our meditation practice, we really can't control how it unfolds. So each spirit walk must be a meditation that is turned completely over to God, as God's will be done, not our own will be done. And whatever it is, I do have spirit walks that are